Hello, everyone, and good afternoon, and welcome to the very first episode for the month of March. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia, the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill, and welcome to the very first episode for the month of March. Now, in this episode, we are in the season 3, episode 3 of the Historians Lounge. And joining me today is a returning guest making her official debut here in the series. Now, for those who remember this guest, she's an historian, author, educator, and creator of the Traditional Legends blog and YouTube channel, specializing in dark folklore with a deep academic background. Holding a Bachelor's of Arts degree in European history and a master's in Antiquities and Classics, her work delves into the often overlooked aspects of history, including the contributions of women, diverse ethnic groups, and the myth that traditional narratives tend to ignore. And our research highlights how common legends and folklore across cultures reflect shared human experiences, fears, and beliefs throughout history. And in today's episode, we'll be talking about a period in history many of us know as the witch trials, but more specifically, we'll be looking at the witch trials in England, but also another trial happened around that time, which were the vampire trials of Eastern Europe. So, without further ado, let's give a huge round of applause to today's guest, fellow historian, author, academic, and all around amazing person, B.R. Williams. B, thank you so much for coming back on the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. So before we dive into this topic, what has been like a recap of what you've been up to since you were last on the show?
Oh my goodness. So I am actually working on a Legends of Sasquatch book, but it's one of those things that it's just like, oh my gosh, where do I want to go with this? What do I want to do? Keep hitting these roadblocks. And my senior thesis was on the witch trials in England and coinciding with folk magic and healers. So I'm in the process of redoing that also so that it can be ready to be published into a book.
Awesome. And then I also know you're also been working on latest blog post, which of course is vampires. So you can tell us a
Yes.
little bit about that. And if I'm not mistaken, specifically, it's the Eastern European vampire, which is the
Right.
Strigoi vampire.
Right. That's the one that, surprise, everyone has been looking at. I have gotten so many views on that. And this really goes back into the deep, deep origins. We'll start here. The film Nosferatu.
Mm.
Well, the remake of Nosferatu with Bill Skarsgård. And that really leans into the early Eastern European idea of the vampire because it wasn't this suave, debonair type vampire
Mm-mm.
that we're used to. Back then, they were revenants. So they literally came up out of the grave. They were dirty. They would have looked more like zombies, maybe.
Mm. That's fascinating. And if you also look at it, and I know my understanding of, vampires and
Mhm.
sort of like dark folklore and mythology is very limited. But from what I've been able to research, when we think of like, vampires and vampirism, the most iconic figure is, of course, Vlad Tepes, who became the
Right.
inspiration for
Hmm.
Dracula. But the Strigoi vampire, from what I've been able to research, some would argue is more dangerous than the modern vampire in terms of, how to get rid of it. There's actually a step-by-step process to determine if
Right.
someone is a Strigoi vampire, which of course leads into today's episode, which are of course the trials of both the vampires and those
Mhm,
deemed as witches. So let's start with the vampires before we delve
mhm.
into the witch trials in England. So where in your research did you like uncover like the first vampire trials? Because when we think of like trials, of course we go to the witches, whether it's in Salem, Massachusetts, or in the
Right,
UK,
right.
but we never hear about those suspected of vampirism.
Well, the vampires is less of a trial and more of a fear of disease. So
Mm,
if someone in a family died, let's say they died of the Black Plague,
All right.
Okay. But then once they were buried, and of course, back then they didn't understand human decomposition as we may understand it a little bit better now. Um, and then the rest of the house would get sick. They would literally dig up the first person deceased because they thought that person was rising from their grave and feeding on their family, bringing more pestilence, more illness, more sickness. And as a matter of fact, many graves uncovered in Eastern Europe still show signs of suspected vampire graves.
Hmm.
There will be a sickle across the neck. So if they tried to come up out of the grave, or sometimes their head would be missing and be placed at their feet. So a
Yes.
lot of this was actually done posthumously, but interestingly enough, during the witch trials, sometimes a suspected witch would be dug up after her death and posthumously tried as a witch.
That is just we would think about that as like bizarre, but we also have
Yeah.
to consider like at this time, religion and faith was heavily intertwined with
Yes.
the communities. I mean, it was
Hmm.
sometimes faith was law. I mean, look at the Salem witch trials. I mean, religion played a
Yes.
huge role into that,
Hmm.
and no exception with those in
Right.
England. And I also find very fascinating when we again talk, the sickle with the head or like the head at the feet.
Hmm.
Another thing also to notice, like people will put, if I'm not mistaken, actual bricks in
Hmm.
relatives' mouths to like stop them from like, trying to bite through
Right.
or trying to break their jaw so that way they
Yeah.
couldn't. Like we would think that as like barbarism and desecration of
Hmm.
human remains. But again, we have to think at the time, these
Oh,
were very
100%.
real things to these people.
Oh, yeah. And what's really, really interesting is some rural villages in Eastern Europe still have this practice to this day.
Really?
It's very hush hush, but some still do practice this.
Fascinating. So now let's take a little tour to the witch
Mhm.
trials of England because I'm very, very
Right.
fascinated about that. So, how did sort of those come about in England? Was it a few years before the Salem witch trials in the 1690s?
It actually, so we, most of us have heard of the Inquisition. The
Mm-hmm.
church was trying to root out heretics.
Right.
So during, let's say, the early modern period, roughly about 1500 to about
Okay.
1700, you have the number one and number two books in England, the King James Bible,
Yes.
commissioned by King James. Prior to that, it was the Geneva Bible.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, the Malleus Maleficarum,
Ooh.
which is a treatise on witchcraft written by Kramer and Springer, who had been inquisitors. And the biggest issue in that, the biggest telltale signs were exactly the same as heretics in the generation preceding that. So it's the same exact thing. And it was just, as you pointed out, religion. It was absolutely religion. And then, as a matter of fact, King James wrote his own book called Demonology.
It's interesting when you look at, these early examples of, witch trials or
Right.
trials of the unknown. And we, scoff at it in, the modern sense because, like
Mhm.
these were, again, heinous acts like of murder.
Right.
But again, we have to understand at this time, people did not separate the supernatural with the real
Mhm.
world. It was very much intertwined. I mean, if you look out throughout human history, they were as real as someone sitting next to you. And it's just fascinating. I know very little of these witch trials in England. So, what was sort of like the first cause of this surge of witch trials? Not maybe not witch trials, probably not the best word, but like the pointing out like, oh, that
Mhm.
person's a witch or she's a witch. How
Right.
did that sort of like ember lead into a
Mhm.
big blaze in the UK?
Right. Well, what's really funny, there are three very common misconceptions that we have in our modern period, and I
Mm.
really blame pop culture on this. First and foremost, healers, those people that practice folk magic spells, things like that, they were not in hiding. You could go to the market, get new horseshoes, and hey, purchase a love spell from the um the man's wife. So they openly plied their trade,
Hmm.
spells over here. Let me give you a potion for this, a potion for that. So it wasn't something that was hidden. Secondly, 99%, well, I don't want to say percentages, but the vast majority of people were actually hanged as opposed to burned.
Oof.
And roughly 20 to 25% of those executed for the crime of witchcraft were men.
Really? So men were
Yes,
accused of like
right.
witchcraft.
And as a matter of fact, although 20 to 25% made up those executed, that doesn't mean that that's all that was, because plenty of men were accused of witchcraft, but executed for other causes. For
Mm.
example, there was the case of a priest, mind you. He was accused of witchcraft. He had abused a young woman, and before he could be executed as a witch, the town took their own justice.
That is crazy. That
Right.
almost making a connection reminds me of the trial of the Knights Templar, who were accused of being
Hmm.
satanic worshippers,
Right.
worshiping Baphomet, even
Hmm.
though the real reason for their execution was purely political. The King of France could not afford to pay off his debts. So, what does he do? He concocts a story
Right.
demonizing the Templars and giving
Hmm.
him the proper tools to sentence them and wipe out possibly one of the most influential military orders in European history. But that is just, it's wild to
Yeah.
think about that. And actually, let's touch a little bit on what you just brought up, B, about,
Hmm.
pop culture. Why is it that sort of pop culture tends to get some aspects of these trials, you know, not entirely accurate? Case in point, example, the Crucible. I know the Crucible is set in
Hmm.
Salem,
Right.
Massachusetts,
Hmm.
but I've heard stories that even that movie is guilty of, personifying the stereotypes of,
Right.
case of healers and other people deemed
Hmm.
as potential witches.
I think a lot of it is the fear factor,
Mm.
naturally. And then in the 70s, you see a lot of, and I don't know, I'll probably get some backlash from women on this one, the raging feminist, completely different from the feminist, but the raging feminist. And I think that's really where it started to kind of pick up because they cherry picked what they wanted their message to be.
Mm.
So I think that's really where we start seeing this kind of moving in the wrong direction. And on top of that, it's only only the past decade or two, that a lot of these records have been able to be transcribed and put onto the internet.
Right.
So people didn't know, they just had to kind of use their imaginations. And I think that's
Yeah,
just where they went with it.
absolutely. And on the topic of imaginations, and going back to what you talked about, the two books, which was like the King James Bible
Hmm.
and the works written by two Inquisition members, one thing I've always found fascinating is how, at that time you had specialists who could point out the,
Hmm.
signs of a witch or signs of a vampire. And in your research, like what has been like the most common features that witch
Hmm.
hunters would have looked for in potential witches?
Interestingly, I think it's less of a feature and more of intent.
Ah,
And
okay.
that is where that very, very fine line is. So you go to a healer. to be healed from some sort of disease or what have you, you're not happy with what happens. You're
Mm,
not happy with the result. So you turn around and say, that person intentionally caused harm to me. And
mm,
that is where the dividing line really stood, and where they would come in and go, oh, well, you meant to do this, so therefore that must mean you're in league with the devil, and so on and so forth. And then it just blows up from there.
absolutely. And that, of course, for any video game fans out there, that almost reminds me of The Witcher 3 in Redenia, the witch hunters. The witch hunters were primarily going after the mages, the healers, and their whole reasoning was they are the cause of all the suffering of our people. And it's
Yep.
just fascinating how even that message is still used, of course, in works of
Mhm.
fiction, but it's become so ingrained in the human psyche. It's just, bananas. Now, what about the vampires and stuff like that in Eastern Europe? Were there kind of similar things that the community looked into? Maybe not so much as features, but like, how a person acted, what they did. Did you come across that in your research?
I think that the acting, and again, that goes more into having psychic control over someone, or someone exhibiting the to seem like they're under control from someone else. Like they're kind of walking around and they're not thinking clearly, or maybe they're suddenly shuffling about when they used to be
Right.
fine, or they're sickly looking. So that would be a sign of a vampire feeding off
Mm,
of their energy,
right. That's
you
actually
know.
incredible. And of course, that also reminds me of, which we can tie it in, is of course the werewolf trials in France. People
Yes.
deemed werewolves, and there were quite a few, if I'm not
Mhm.
mistaken. There was one case of a young shepherd who was
Mhm.
accused of, I think, killing almost like 2 dozen people, many of them being women and children, and he admitted to these crimes. And of course, you have to take it with a grain of salt because we do not know if this was a forced confession or if this was a confession
Mhm.
of his own volition. And there were many, many times, these people were either executed or burned at the stake. And what I found very fascinating in my own research on, those suspected of lycanthropy, these people are looking at, the physical attributes, hair in between
Mhm.
the brow, uh, certain facial features, isolated, very, very hairy, again, away from society, which I guess this whole idea of, this separation from society may be universal when it comes looking at,
Mhm.
those suspected of vampirism and those accused of witchcraft, that they're not part of society. They are alien, they're foreign.
Exactly. Oh, what better way to get rid of someone that you don't like?
Mm-hmm.
Someone that, oh, that's just a crazy person down the street. Let's, they're a vampire, they're a witch, they're a werewolf. And what's interesting, you bring up werewolves, there's a lot of overlapping in werewolf and vampire lore.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the early vampire literature and things like that, you will see the case of the vampire turning into a wolf. And then, of course, you have the witches. The witches have familiars, or
Yes.
they're able to shapeshift. So across this supernatural spectrum, you see a lot of overlap.
That's absolutely correct. And going back to the witches, I've been fascinated by, like the length of time these trials lasted. Here in the States, we had the
Mhm,
Salem witch trials, which lasted for, I think, from like 1692 to 1698. I could be wrong in my dates.
mhm.
But how long did the witch trials of England last? And did they sort of like sporadically pop up every now and then?
It depends on where you are. Germany, by and large, had the most active witch trials, executions, so on and so forth.
Really?
And when you think about geography, you have Germany and you have Austria, right? They're neighbors. the Habsburg Empire of Austria, which used to be Austria-Hungary,
Mm-hmm.
ruled over Eastern Europe, where we have the vampires. So you start to see the connections between the two. Even during the witch trials, there were a lot of academics, a lot of scholars saying, y'all are crazy. There's no such thing as witches, and you need to stop this. And there were a lot of people very high up within the royal court that were saying, look, stop, stop. And as we start moving into the Age of Enlightenment, late
Mm-hmm.
1600s, 1700s, that's when you really start seeing it starting to, phase out. But what's interesting, as we go through that Age of Enlightenment and we get into the 1800s, Bram Stoker wrote Dracula in the 1800s.
You
So
did.
we see where it starts kind of shifting with the times, actually.
Absolutely. And again, it's just so fascinating how, these folkloric beings are intertwined with history. And I think it'll be really cool to talk about the book you've mentioned, which is the demonology, the book of demons and stuff
Mm-hmm.
like that. Because when we think of, like, a book of demonology, we tend to think of it more purely fiction in realms of
Right.
D&D or Diablo and
Mm-hmm.
so forth. But there's actually a real book that existed that
Mm-hmm.
detailed how to look for these entities. So was this like regional? Was this published throughout Europe, or was it only popular in certain nations where these activities, these trials, or these executions were more prevalent?
I think it was more popular throughout Europe because it was written by King James.
Mm,
But not to say he didn't have his detractors. He did. And as a matter of fact, Queen Elizabeth I had her own court conjurer, John Dee. And back then, astrology and astronomy were underneath the same umbrella.
right.
And John Dee wrote extensively. He wrote books about the Enochian angelic language.
Ooh.
So he even picked the date for Queen Elizabeth's coronation based upon the movement of the stars. And she relied heavily on him. So it's really funny that you have all these witch trials going on, but then, and the Malleus Maleficarum, the religion, the book on demonology, and all of this is happening all at the same time. And it's almost a contradiction.
It is. It is very interesting when you talk about, because how can you say like these practices are a heresy on one end of the spectrum, but on the other end, you have these practices like astronomy and astrology, which are
Hmm.
heavily used by the royals, which some could argue, these were accepted because we can control these, we can understand them to some
Hmm.
degree, whereas more local folk religion and cultures may be outside the norm of society. And then it goes back to this whole notion of these people outside of civilization. They are not us,
Hmm.
they are them. And it's just baffling. And speaking of, baffling things, one thing I've also been very fascinated is, how do we determine who's a witch? Like, probably the most famous one that I think has been immortalized
Hmm.
in Monty Python, which is how to tell whether or not a person is a witch. And if she weighs as much as a duck, which is the same weight as wood, she is a witch. Now, don't know that's actually very true, viewers and listeners, but they did have
Hmm.
something similar where if a witch drowned or a person drowned, oh, they were a witch or not, or if they were made of wood, would float, so they were a witch. If they sunk,
Right.
they were human. It's just baffling. Did you come across like any other lesser known cases of who is a witch or not in your research?
Not so much, but on the vampire front, I did come across something very interesting. And I
Okay.
believe it was in the late 1800s. The
Really?
late 1800s, in New England. There was a New England vampire panic.
Really?
Yes, because tuberculosis.
Ah, yes.
So they, and which, okay, tuberculosis, it's a wasting disease. It's basically just it's eating up your lungs. You're going to go pale, you're going to be tired, you're going to have dark circles. You're going to naturally, because you're coughing up blood, have blood coming out of your mouth. So in essence, there was a vampire panic. People thought there were vampires on the loose as late as the 1800s in America.
That is
Meanwhile,
crazy.
they're inventing flight and motorized vehicles, and people think there's vampires. So I find that so interesting, the juxtaposition between the modernity and moving forward and these old world fears.
That's just crazy. But yeah, like viewers and listeners, like tuberculosis, that was probably like the most telltale sign if someone was
Mm-hmm.
a vampire or not. And if I'm not also not mistaken, they also look up that too, like going back to what you said about, relatives digging up bodies because they didn't understand human decomposition. If
Right.
someone died of tuberculosis and there's still blood on their mouth, they're
Mm-hmm.
going to assume, oh, he recently fed, we got to cut off
Right.
his head. And that's why you have a lot of graves where there are possibly
Mm-hmm.
no heads or heads that are at the feet and everything. And let's actually take a little bit of the vampires, specifically talking about the Strigoi vampires, because I know some people have differences on Strigois being classified as vampires as opposed to
Mm-hmm.
being undead individuals. So, in your research, B, and in your opinion, do you consider a Strigoi to be a vampire or an undead entity like a zombie?
That is a really good question. And yes, they are very akin to zombies, but the whole idea of brain eating zombies is more of a modern iteration as
Hmm.
opposed to a classic. A classic zombie is really pretty much out of Haitian voodoo hoodoo, in which the person has been poisoned by a shaman and they've
Mm,
been brought back to life to do the shaman's bidding. So a revenant or a strigoi would be something that would be feeding on the living, whether it is energy or psychic or even physically feeding on them. So, in
right.
that sense, I would still classify them as, at the very least, a vampire like creature,
Okay.
because going going back through the history of vampirism, I did write a book on it because it got so much attention. So I wrote a book called Trails of Blood: Legends of the Vampire,
Ooh, I like that.
and I've traced it all the way back. And throughout all cultures, there are vampire-like beings. Naturally, they differ, from one way to another, but every culture, there are vampire-like beings.
That is incredible. And you're absolutely right. Vampirism goes throughout all history and it takes on its own shape. I've even
Mhm,
read some documents that people classify Draugrs, undead Norse warriors, in some regards as
mhm,
vampires, and some argue that they are, zombies, that they rise from the dead. It takes on, whatever view you want to look at them, as well as the Philippines have their own case of vampires. And of course, in Chinese film and media, you have the hopping vampires, which,
mhm.
from an audience perspective, is comical, but still, it's one example
Right.
of vampirism. And again, it's so interesting how, these characters, these beings can change over time, but yet still retain some
Mhm,
familiarity. And I know in the modern age, we always try to, reinvent, these beings,
mhm,
vampires, witches, trying to make them more grounded, sometimes tying them to, the natural world. but sometimes there's something very more fascinating about the unnatural and the
Mhm.
supernatural. And let's actually look at the witches in that case, because again,
Mhm.
going to the Crucible, and in that first scene, you have so many people, specifically young girls, who are fascinated by oh, love potions, making this person
Right.
fall in love with me, and so forth. Or sometimes people using witches to place a curse on somebody.
Mhm.
And these, as you said, these are people who were part of society. Everyone knew who they were and stuff like that. So it's just fascinating. And honestly, what has probably been your most favorite story that you've uncovered when it comes to researching witches and the witch trials?
Actually, I think it's a little bit strange. The verse, there's a Bible verse, and this is really what lit the flame, if you will.
Okay.
Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. That that has been the defining verse across the Malleus Maleficarum, demonology, all of that. And as we go back, and we're looking at a time where religion used to just be the church.
Mm-hmm.
It was all Catholic, and then it started splitting into different factions and
Right.
Protestantism and all that, as well as we're leaving an era where people were by and large uneducated. They could not read, they
Yes.
could not write. They were relying on upon the church to tell them. So now it's coming out that that verse, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live, there's questions about the translation.
Ah.
And the original Hebrew translation, many scholars are now arguing, should not be thou shalt not suffer a witch to live, thou shalt not suffer a poisoner to live.
Mm.
Because the word that they're looking at, they're saying, no, that doesn't mean witch. That means someone who cuts herbs and things like that with the intent to poison.
That is
So
fascinating.
yeah, so it changes the entire perspective on everything.
Yes, and I also think that brings up a new discussion when it comes to translation, like what is classified
Mhm.
as a witch, because at some historical periods, a term like a witch would not be the most accurate, term for that individual.
Right.
Poisoner would probably been more acceptable,
Mhm.
an herbalist, something like that,
Mhm.
or it's just very fascinating, like these modern terms or pre-modern terms exist. Case in point, I was actually watching a documentary on, the Romans, and talked about this one woman who was partnered up or helped the Romans, but she was classified as a witch. Now that begs the question: the Romans probably would not have used the term witch, because that would have not have been the right term. A poisoner, or maybe an
Mhm.
herbalist, or
Right.
possibly, if we're looking
Mhm.
at more Celtic mythology, a druid would have probably been the most acceptable. It is very, very fascinating. And like, just one little term could completely
Right.
change the course of history. Like, oh, we didn't mean witch, we meant poisoner. But the reason why
Mhm.
people use witch is that that's the best way people can understand who that
Mhm.
is. It's just baffling, again, how one little translation could change history.
It really is, and a lot of times they were called cunning people because they were smart, they knew how to use herbs, and
Hmm.
what's very interesting, we hear about a grimoire. This is where you
Yes.
write a grimoire, and this was one of my favorite things I found out. It's not what we think it is.
Ooh, okay.
So back then, paper, writing implements, things like that were a little harder to come by.
Right.
So what happened, women had a receipt book, which today would translate to a recipe book.
Ooh, okay.
And this would be passed from mother to daughter and so on and so forth down the line, each woman adding in her own recipes, her own remedies, her own medical remedies, her own little pieces of wisdom. So that's the origin of a grimoire. It's actually a receipt book passed down for generations by women. And if they were neighbors or they were very close, a lot of these recipe or receipt books have the same recipes in them because they would share.
Absolutely, and that of course leads to the fictional counterpart, which is the Grimorum, which is
Mhm.
a spell book that is passed down through the ages.
Right.
And then another one, which I'm very curious if this may have come up in your research, B, and may have been like the inspiration for it, is the Necronomicon, which has been used in a lot of different media. Like it's been used as like the book to some of the dead or stuff like that. And I'm wondering, in your research, when looking at either vampires or witches, has something like that ever come up, like a book of the dead
Mhm.
or like a book of spirits?
Um, I would say now there's a biblical reference into that.
Okay.
The Witch of Endor, in which she could summon the king's ancestors.
Ooh, okay.
And spiritually speaking, that was something uh this kind of goes into the ghost section of it, but people believed that their ancestors could come back and offer them wisdom, give them advice, things like that. So yes, they would go seek out a cunning man or a cunning woman and ask them to confer with the spirits of their deceased loved ones.
That is that always just reminds me of, the classics with, the cults
Hmm.
where these people would, try to contact family members from beyond, or even if you were a soldier in Athens going to the cult of Athena to try to
Oh
say,
yeah.
I need to hear Athena's words to let me know, are we going to win? I mean, people actually did this. And again,
Hmm.
we have to understand this was part of everyday life for these people going all the way back to the classical age. I mean,
Hmm.
religion, folk history, cultures, that was intertwined with everyday life. And if it wasn't part of your everyday life, you were seen as an outsider.
Hmm.
Now, I am also intrigued of, when we talk about, again, going back to like, the appearances of like witches and vampires, you brought up Nosferatu, which is the remake
Hmm.
of Nosferatu being, very pale, kind of
Hmm.
ghastly, this, living specter. But I'm curious, in terms of history, how do we sort of get to that understanding? Like, that is what a vampire is supposed to look like. Also, in the same case of witches, because when we think of witches, of course, we're going to think of like Wizard of Oz with
Hmm.
green skin, pointed nose,
Right.
all black attire. But yet, in more recent media, we're kind of seeing this mixture of the fantasy with history, where they're still having that, nastily expression, pointed
Hmm.
nose, boils, and everything, but they're more kind of on the lines of like an herbalist, a druid,
Hmm.
something that's beyond civilization. So, have you come across that, like, the history of the representation of vampires and witches?
It actually varies from location to location,
Okay.
and it relies heavily upon culture.
Mm,
And for us, it's naturally been um, uh, it's been colored by pop culture, which if you think about the 1800s, you're thinking, the Victorian age, everything was gothic and dark. And I think that's
yes.
where we get a lot of our thought process as
Mm,
to what is what. I mean, for example, Mary Shelley,
yes.
she got her idea for Frankenstein from attending a lecture in which they took a cadaver and hit it with electrodes to show that it would still move. These were public lectures that they were doing at that time. And Mary Shelley and her friends, they would sit around telling each other spooky stories. So I think that's really a lot of what we see today just spring out of different cultures and what they thought or imagined things to be.
Nice. This is why I love doing the show, because I learned so much from so many different people, and also on topics that I know very little to nothing about. Like, I love folklore. I love when it comes to mythology, and it comes to like vampires, witches,
Mhm.
werewolves, and other beings of mythology and cultural folklore. It's interesting to see how much history has influenced them, and sometimes history can add to their lore,
Mhm.
which that is also very, very fascinating when it comes to, like, witches. They have these attributes from the past. It's like, oh well, these are different witches, so we got to combine these two stories together. And
Mhm.
like how we have these beings in history. It's like, oh, this person's a warlock, this person's a mage. There are so many histories I found on beings who possibly may not have existed in history, and yet they are revered as doing these incredible things. So let's actually talk a little bit about that. So, were there any famous people in your research, B, that stood out to you that offer a lens into the history of, witches and witch trials, as well as vampires and how vampires were treated culturally in Eastern Europe?
I think it's really just an overall sort of thing, like you said, the outcasts, those who are
Mm.
ostracized. I really didn't before my research, I didn't know what a role King James played
Mm.
in, fueling the witch trials and the fear and things like that. So that I didn't know. But when I did do my research on finding out the origin of the vampire. That was interesting
Okay.
because that goes back to ancient Egypt.
Ooh, really? Can you tell us
Yes.
about that?
So Ra felt that his people were not worshiping him appropriately, and he sent his daughter Sekhmet to teach them a lesson. She went a little overboard and developed this bloodlust, and she is considered the first vampire.
Really?
So Ra tricked her and gave her a glass of red wine that he had put a sleeping potion in and told her it was blood to get her to drink it and make her stop.
Really? So culturally,
Hmm.
this is the first account of vampirism, because most people
Yes.
think of vampires, the first
Hmm.
vampire or vampire-like person is, of course, Vlad Tepes, who
Right.
immortalized and is the inspiration for Vlad Dracul. But
Hmm.
Sekhmet, a being
Hmm.
from Egyptian mythology, is
Yeah.
considered the first vampire because she developed this bloodlust. And I actually remember
Right.
this story. Like, she went on a huge killing spree, like
Hmm.
killing a lot of people. And where I was like, okay, you've gone a little overboard. I am appreciative that you've done this, but
Yeah.
reel it in. And then, of course, that makes Setmek considered now, and it could be wrong. If there are
Hmm.
any Egyptologists in the call after this interview and want to type on it, definitely let me know that she's considered a war goddess because
Hmm.
of that bloodlust, because of her ferocity. That is wild. That is just crazy. But thank you for
Hmm.
sharing that, B. I did
You're
not know
welcome.
that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting. And then when you stop and think about trade routes and all these different cultures coming into contact with each other, it's no wonder that all these legends spread and maybe even, as you said, took on characteristics from others. Oh, well, this is what a witch looks like in our culture, but this is what it looks like in this culture. So then there's a blending of that.
Absolutely. And
And
I definitely
eventually
think
we get.
And I definitely think the one that we haven't talked about, which you mentioned before, B, is of course the Inquisition, which was integral in
Right.
the werewolf trials, vampire trials, the witch trials. And in your research, looking into the history of vampires and witches, of course, I imagine the Inquisition came up like
Mhm.
prevalent in your history. So I'm curious, in your research, gathering your sources, what's probably been the most uncomfortable piece of history that you've uncovered from the Inquisition, either pertaining to a witch trial, a vampire trial, or any other trial of an individual that was deemed a follower of Satan and a what's the word I'm thinking of? One deemed of heresy.
Mhm. I think the most uncomfortable is they didn't just go after adults, they would go after children.
Mm-hmm.
And there are cases of little children that would languish in these prisons and have to undergo these witch tests, you know? So I think that's the worst that I've come across is targeting children.
Yeah, that is unsettling. But for people who have researched and who have studied the Inquisition, it did have its mission politically and religiously. But even people in the courts had their own opinions of the Inquisition that sometimes they went too far and had their
Oh, yeah.
own ulterior motives for working
Mhm.
with the monarchs. They didn't just root out the enemies of the monarch,
Right.
they went out against enemies of the church, enemies of the state,
Mhm.
which to them is the church. There are
Right.
so many instances, people suffering the rack, the
Mhm.
iron bowl,
Right.
or the pommel horse, which I could be wrong in that term, but for people who know that kind of torture device, it was one of the among the many other tools the Inquisition used, was possibly the most painful, which that was the Inquisition's main goal, was pain and
Right.
extracting a confession. Even if you were innocent, they didn't care. If they had an inkling that you
Mm.
were guilty of a crime, whether you consorted with the devil, or you put a curse on somebody, or
Mhm.
you poisoned somebody, you were on their radar, which is very, very unfortunate. And sort of like the last few questions I did want to ask you, B, before we
Mhm.
wrap this up. So you mentioned before in New England in the late
Mhm.
1800s that you had the first that we had the first vampire outbreak here in the States,
Mhm.
and of course, you had the case of vampirism in the 1800s. Now, did the Inquisition ever come up in your research during that period, or did they kind of just fade away from the history books after the 16s, and
Right.
1700s?
It did fade away, but that's not to say that the churches did not go after those that they thought were, outcasts. You know, if there's
Mm,
someone in the town that doesn't go to church, then, oh, they're in league with Satan. So that was still going on, even though they didn't come out and say the Inquisition.
mm, interesting. And which is very, very true. Which, of course, also reminds me of another pop culture Brotherhood of the Wolf, which was about probably one of the most famous werewolf cases, the Beast of Javado, which, for
Mhm.
those who don't know, from 1774 to 1776 in the region of Javado, the townspeople were at the mercy or the vengeful wrath of a werewolf creature that just killed numerous people, mainly women and children. And there are famous individuals who have stood up against, the beast. But going back to the movie in particular, there was sort of like a cult of church who want to condemn the king for, not doing his job and want to take over. And again, that could be a whole discussion in of itself. But the truth is, or the point I'm trying to make is, the church in history would sometimes use its power and
Mhm.
authority in what they deemed was the greater good to protect its followers, even if that meant persecuting others they deemed to be not part
Mhm.
of the cultural norm. And as we wrap up this discussion, B, there's just one question I did want to ask you. Why do you think historically and culturally it's important to learn about, these witch trials, these vampire trials, and other trials that pertain to the dark folklore? Most people would think, well, it's witches, vampires,
Mhm.
werewolves. Like, why do we have to learn these? I think that it's important to learn these, that if you just remove the label of vampire, werewolf, and witch, you see a
Mhm.
very darker history, which some
Right.
have argued have been repeated throughout human
Mhm.
history. It's just taken on a different name.
Absolutely. Dark folklore, the witches, the vampires, the werewolves, they underscore our fears.
Hmm.
That's really what it is. It is a shared fear across culture. And ultimately, it's the fear of the unknown.
Absolutely.
And it's a fear of the unknown, it's the fear of death, it's the fear of the lack of control. And
Hmm.
it's the fear of something bigger than we are coming to get us that we can't
Yes.
fight. So I think that we need to understand, it's just like a kid. Hey, there's monsters in my closet. And mom or dad comes in and looks and shows them there's no monsters. That's why we need to understand this. There's no monsters. That's what we need to understand. And when it comes down to it, I think humans are the real monsters.
Which that has been a phrase used in a lot of media and a lot of books, that
Mhm.
humanity is the most dangerous monster. And if I'm not mistaken, I could be misquoting that, but out of all the monsters in, human history, humanity is the most dangerous because we are the only ones that can kill our own for
Mhm.
pleasure or for sport. Animals or beasts of nature hunt for survival.
Mhm.
Humans, we don't have to do that. And I forgot where I heard that from, but it is very, very integral to human history, that uh, the savagery. And also, is when we look at these natures of humanity, these are individuals who are doing these things. I mean, they have to
Mhm.
really be changed to do that, which, to end it all off on this not somber note, but a very profound note, is that
Mhm.
until you know how far you're willing to understand your own human savagery, you don't
Mhm.
have the capacity to do good. Tames to these, witch
Mhm.
trials and these vampire trials, tying back to what you mentioned, Brie, about the Enlightenment. These people
Mhm.
went through a very dark period in their life to do these acts of harm to their fellow citizens. And around the age of Enlightenment, after seeing how far they were willing to go, they were terrified of it and reached enlightenment like, we need to do
Mhm.
better. We cannot keep doing this anymore. But as we discussed in this episode, viewers and listeners, some pockets of hysteria have shown up now and then, and it's always important to understand them and what we can learn from them. And on that, not as happy note, maybe a little somber note, but still a very good note. Thank you, everyone, for joining me for episode 3 of season 3 of the Historians Lounge. And a huge thank you to B.R. Williams for making her return back to the show. Now, B, where can people find you on social media? And do you have any upcoming projects you would like to share? Any books coming out, any blog posts, any YouTube videos that we should be on the lookout for?
Our next YouTube video is going to be about the Mandela effect. And for those who don't know, in the 1980s, there's a section of society that remembers Nelson Mandela died in prison. But in reality, he was released and went on to live a full life. So we're digging into all these different things that we think, wait, wasn't it this when really it's this? Um, I'm working on the Sasquatch book. I'm working on my hunting folk during the early modern period, and I'm trying to put out blog posts every week.
Awesome. I will link all of them below in the description of this video. And if you want to see BR's first interview on the channel, I will also link it here for you to go and check it out. I urge you all to do. It's a really, really good episode and possibly one of my favorites of last year. And as always, thank you everyone for joining me for the first episode for the month of March. Again, a huge thank you to B for making her return back on the show,
Thank
and we
you.
wish her the very best. And hopefully, I can have her back sometime later in the year, possibly for October, because if many of you remember, I am in the process of doing a Halloween themed episode about Gothic literature, Gothic lore, and what we've learned from it. So if you want to see that episode, stay tuned and follow me on all my social media, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Blue Sky. And as always, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe down below. What was your favorite part of today's episode? And also, what being from dark folklore do you think has a lot of untapped historical importance? Make sure to write that down below. And as always, this is the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill signing out, wishing you all a wonderful day.